Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Graphics Project 2022. Tonight we'll hear from GSAPP's own Josh Jordan, and then after that, Melissa Deckert and Nicole Licht from Party of One. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to remind everybody that there will be portfolio reviews in 2 weeks, which you can sign up for. You can read more about that, the requirements for that on the Graphics Project website or the page on the GSAPP website, which, you know, it's a chance for you to discuss your work in progress portfolios with practitioners. So I think that'll be a good opportunity for you to sort of kind of check where you are and begin really thinking in earnest about your graduating portfolios. Okay, so as you are all very familiar with Josh, he's the director of the making studio here at GSAPP. He has an MArch from UPenn, from his hometown of Philadelphia. He has a background in commercial fabrication, general contracting, and restoration. He has also worked in architecture offices, both in Philadelphia and Vancouver. And he has led the design and fabrication of the never built city on the panorama of the city of New York at the Queen's Museum, which is, was an amazing thing in 2017, and contributed to the fabrication of Not Another Tower project by Tatiana Bilbao Studio in 2017 at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Last year, when we were all confined to the limitations of our private spaces, Josh showed us just how much was possible using our now very, very powerful, smartphones that we all have access to. Compared to then, we have a bit more mobility and a bit more freedom now. But I think regardless of what's happening in the world, we're almost always constrained by time and money, equipment, and skills. Which is why I'm really grateful that Josh is joining us here again this year to share his really valuable knowledge around models, photos, and staging. Thank you for coming, Josh.
Thanks, UJ. And I would say that phones have only gotten more powerful since last year. I think my snazzy Pixel 6 has like a 50 megapixel camera on it or something like that. So this is going to be sort of mostly brass tacks tonight, just talking about photography. And my experience with GSAPP in the last 5 years and GSAPP students is that you're all pretty accomplished photographers already, whether you're just starting out of necessity or you've been doing it pretty consistently for a couple of years. So most of what I sort of know and learn and teach back is sort of amplified from what I've observed from students, student projects, and then some of the more extended projects that the shop has gotten into. So tonight, I'm going to just set everything up with a couple case studies really quickly from GSAPP to show you sort of what a photo project looks like in the background. And then I have a pre-recorded segment because it's easier to chop into a sort of cooking show style thing where everything's already done, of building a photography studio at home using your smartphone. I'm going to just make sure that I'm not frozen. Okay, I'm not frozen. So making a mini photography studio at home and using your smartphone and sort of linking it through Lightroom, which is available for your smartphone, building a workflow. All of these lessons are, so last year we were talking about all the lessons of photography writ large that can be sort of compressed into a home studio. And this year we're sort of talking about the lessons of a home studio extended to photography writ large, and it sort of works both ways. Okay, so let me set you up by showing a little bit about photography at GSAPP. So the way that I would thematically frame, well, my screen sharing is paused. I don't want that. Resume share. Can everybody see my screen sharing? Okay, it says it's paused. So can you see just double checking, you're seeing slides advanced now? Okay, great. Nope, still on the first one?
Just seeing the first slide.
See? I told you this was happening. Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to go back to share the entire thing. We're going to do the desktop, taking a risk. Okay. Can you see the slides advancing now?
Yes.
Okay, it's flicking through them. Okay, so the way that I want to frame photography, the way that it's sort of being approached now at GSAPP is with the word scenography, and talking about staging so much as sort of composition and framing and the traditional elements of photography, because so much of what I see going on right now is photography not only being used as sort of like another drawing type or another sort of, checkbox in the step of documenting a project that's complete, but as a sort of a process-based way of documentation and approaching models as, fragments that are supposed to be captured in a particular way or have movable or fungible parts, rather than the sort of product photography style of one object. This is sort of like a broad topic that can be sort of discussed in terms of a lot of what production and graphics and representation looks like in architecture education right now. But I see a lot of it happening, and it sort of jives with the way that we like to do things in the shop, which is, all chopped up and sort of customized as we go. So I'm talking about models that it's kind of like when you only model the part in Rhino that you intend on rendering. There's a sort of an analog in photography where you compose a scene based on the way that you intend on taking a photo. And so we see photographs that are sort of used back in the drawing world as diagrams and then sort of cycled back into an architectural project. It might be frozen, so I'm going to pause a second. And then I see this situation happening a lot, which is super elaborate stagings of photographs, which I absolutely love. Sort of turning the studio into a workshop with moving parts that can capture a picture in many particular ways. So like no one object in the scene sort of looks photographable, but composed, it's almost like the construction of a theater set. So when we talk about staging, you have to look at a couple projects from GSAPP that we've been involved in the last couple of years. One of these projects was the Stagecraft exhibition by James Ewing in the Ross Gallery 3 or 4 years ago, where we unearthed these models from Ken Frampton's classes over the last couple of decades. And sort of to give them a send-off, James staged and lit and photographed the models in this sort of hyper-realistic style. And so not only were the models and photographs really beautiful, but I love this as a precedent because James is sort of like slightly grumpy and old school about the way that he does things. And so he insisted on everything coming directly out of the camera. So nothing that you see is photoshopped, except in terms of, changing exposure maybe a little bit in Lightroom. But most of what he did, the way that he worked was to try to capture almost everything directly into the camera. And I have a couple pictures of what these stagings look like in a minute. Another project that Yunjae mentioned was the Never Built New York exhibition at the Queens Museum in Queens. And so what we did is, our part in this was constructing about 200 models at 1 to 1200 scale of buildings that were planned but were never built in New York. And to sort of capture the entirety of the project before it left GSAPP and landed on the model, we commissioned this photography session. And what I want to say about it is that this is like one like far pull of photographic technique, in that we spent, I think, 4 days getting 6 shots, and James considered that working really, really fast. And so the amount of sort of staging that went into these things, with sort of moving of backdrops and the physical positioning of lights and the swapping out of materials as bases to provide the right kind of reflectivity, reflects a way of working that really shows up in the photographs. So something like this is the sort of zoomed out staging of the photograph that you see here. And it was just really, really, really precise movements around of the lights until he got this effect. Really fun project. Smoke machines, brings a smoke machine everywhere he goes. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is I'm gonna roll the tape on a smartphone sort of tutorial, sort of photography basics, and I'm going to be here in the background. So if you have questions as we go, I'm available to answer them in the chat. So we can do a sort of like live Q&A if people have questions as they pop up without me actually stopping the tape. So actually, this is what we're doing. We're sharing my desktop, aren't we? Give me 1 second. All right, does everybody see this video? And then Yunjae, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear it?
But there's realistically, this is something that you can and probably should be doing at home, that you can recreate a sort of professional setup pretty cheaply and with minimal effort. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So while I have all of the resources of the shop around me right here, we're not going to look at that tonight. And instead, we're going to look at
my apartment. Now, your apartment might be slightly different than mine in terms of the amount of windows or the people that live in it, but the premise is basically the same in how it's different from the shop, in that you have less space, less access to equipment, more things to work around, and maybe less control over the light in the room. So first, before we get into it, I want to talk about what you need, absolutely need versus maybe need, and there's a little bit of blurring between the two. You can figure it out as you go along. Obviously, the first thing that you'll need if you're going to take photos with your smartphone is your smartphone. I'm using an old Galaxy S9 that has a busted screen, but still works as a camera because it's better than my current phone. If you are
no longer true,
sort of leveled up from me in phone world and have an iPhone, you probably have a better camera on your phone than I do. Either one will work perfectly, and the workflow that we're going to go over today is the same basically for both of them.
A quick note on the software that I show tonight, it's the same sort of additions as it was when this video was made last year. So it's all up to date.
The next thing that's absolutely essential to this, at least I'm arguing it is a miniature tripod. You can get these for, between 10 and 15 bucks on your favorite internet retail outlet that I won't name. But the idea is that it can extend, a little bit more than maybe up to 2 feet. This one is pretty rinky-dink, has legs that can sort of collapse in. It's really flimsy, but the best part about smartphone photography is that you don't need something that's sturdy to hold up your smartphone. What the tripod does need, however, is a way to hold on to your phone. So the one that I have right now that I'm showing has a little extra component that I bought separately that actually grabs onto your phone. But you can buy a lot of this ensemble as one thing, tripod and smartphone holder together for pretty much the same cost. The other things that you absolutely need are a good backdrop. And I'm going to work today with a white one and a black one. They make photo backdrop paper that you can purchase online or in photo stores. Just take really any higher quality, slightly matte is better paper will work that has a little bit of heft to it. For the black backdrop, I'm going to be using a piece of fabric today that is currently sitting behind the camera drying. Black foam core works as well. But remember, you're going to need something in terms of paper to sort of take up the flex of the little photo studio that we're going to show today. Another thing you're going to need is tape. Masking tape is fine. Have some, I just mentioned foam core, have some extra on hand that you can use for what we're going to call a bounce board, reflecting light, white in this case. Another thing I'm suggesting as required, just because it's so inexpensive, are either barbecue skewers or chopsticks and hot glue. Where's my hot glue gun? It's right here somewhere. But combination of little rigid elements and masking tape and hot glue, you'll basically be able to build any sort of miniature frame to create your photo studio. Okay, so what's optional in this workflow? This one, a remote shutter button for your camera, for your smartphone, works with your smartphone. These are about, $7 online and are kind of a game changer in terms of any kind of photo studio having a remote shutter. These are Bluetooth Just about every generic one works equally with iPhones and Androids as far as I found. Super easy to set up. Really, really great for streamlining your workflow. A couple other things that are optional depending on how sort of complex you want to get into your lighting tweaks are diffusing elements like trace paper, also aluminum foil for masking off light and reflecting it more vividly than, say, a white balance board. Finally, and this is optional because it depends very much on your situation, but extension cords. This is a super cool one that has outlets along the run of the, say, 12-foot cord, so you can plug things in. This is almost professional, this level, what you would use in a photo studio. You can use any sort of rinky-dink little extension cords will do, but you'll need them, trust me. The last thing that I would put on the optional sort of category, even though it's not optional, is light sources that you're going to need to take photos. So obviously that's not optional, but I say optional because it's optional that you might go in and get yourself a little $10 battery-powered light source that you can move around easily. The non-optional, essential version of this is just using desk lamps from your house or using natural light if you have the kind of setup that permits it. One of the other optional elements I want to splice in here today is gels, aka acetate, colored plastic transparencies. These, you can edit a lot of the quality of the light and exposure in post-processing, editing your photos. What you can't do as easily is selectively edit colors of light in different parts of the photograph. So what do you need camera-wise, software-wise on your smartphone? Well, almost nothing. I'm going to give you one required thing and one optional thing. First thing you need is the camera software on your phone. And on most phones, the onboard camera is great. This is an Android phone and I guess a Samsung phone, which has its own software. And what I'm going to do is just find Pro mode or manual mode, or they might call it something else on different phones. The thing that Pro mode does, kind of hard to see the little emblems here, but it gives you control over all of the camera settings, the optical settings, the shutter settings, the aperture settings, all of those things that add up to professional photography. You can tweak them within your phone's parameters. Having the ability to change the focus manually on your phone's camera will open up a lot of other little possibilities of what you can do. So iPhone onboard camera software is great. iPhones actually have two, the newer sort of super duper iPhones have two primary lenses built in at different lengths, so you can take different zooms of photographs. The other piece of software that I'm going to show you though is Lightroom Mobile. So this is available for both Androids and iPhones. And what it is a sort of like a stripped down miniature version of the Lightroom that you have installed on either your computer or your studio computer that you have access to. And it's a simple version of it. The key part is that you can sync. And I'm going to show you just in a minute how to set up syncing between your phone and Lightroom on your computer, which means you're essentially just creating a tether between your phone camera and Lightroom on your computer, where you can do everything you need to make the photos look awesome. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a table and a backdrop. But the basic idea is that you create as seamless a surface as you can with your backdrop. If yours is like me and there's dog hair all over it, every time you flinch, you'll have to spend a little extra time cleaning it off, but so goes it. All right, so I've obviously set up a black background instead of a white one, but the key difference in this setup that I want to show you is the separation between the backdrop and the table itself. You can do this either with a white or a black background or whatever color background you happen to be using, but this setup is slightly different and you can get some things out of it that you can't get out of the other one and vice versa. All right, for the sake of comparison, let's just take a couple pictures really quickly to see where we can get to. So I'm going to use Lightroom's onboard camera because it's there in the Lightroom mobile app, just on the auto settings, and using my remote trigger button, take the photograph. Not a bad photograph. Very, very evenly lit, but in frame, sharp enough with the auto settings. So not a bad photograph, pretty plain. But one of the disadvantages of this sort of technique is that there's not too many ways to go from here, because I have very little control over the level of ambient light in the room. In fact, there's just way too much of it. So what can you do to control the ambient light in your room? If you're using the natural light that's coming in the windows, the way that you want to set yourself up primarily is, if you can, have your natural light source be 90 degrees to, or about 90 degrees to your stage that you're setting up photographs in. So if you have a window over here, coming in from my right, you want everything to be sitting facing perpendicularly to it. Using direct sunlight can be very, very difficult because the intensity of the light just washes the shadows out immediately and you get things that look like this. So how can you, in the daytime, control the light in your space? Well, you can try anything that you have available to yourself. If you have blackout curtains like some people have, those are really handy in blocking out the light. Or you can do the sort of old school method and pin up blankets and sleeping bags and whatever else you have around to block the light out as much as you can. Since you still want to be letting light through, if you're using shades or blankets to block out the natural light that's coming in your room, give it an ability to come in still that's sort of as controlled and minimal as possible. So what photo studios will sometimes do is have a strip light for a directional fill light. You can imitate that by having two blankets pinned up on a window and just let light come in through the crack. Anything that you can do to sort of control the amount of angles that light is coming from. So it's going to be very different if you have a diffuse sheer curtain over a big window versus having very bright light coming just through one little sort of 1 foot strip in the window is generally better. Another thing I didn't mention that you'll see in professional photography setups is that they'll have a million tripods to hold up everything that they're using to stage the scene. Unless you have a million tripods, this option will not be available to you. So how are you actually going to be holding and positioning things around the room, lights, gels, with anything that you can find. So chairs, tables, stacks of books, selfie sticks, especially rigid plants, whatever you have, use it to hold things up in the scene. So let's look back for a second really quickly at the photograph that we already took and some others that I've taken during the day in this condition of diffuse light. So I don't have any artificial lights on in the room right now, which is good for the photo setup, but light is sort of coming from everywhere. So you'll see that these photos are all very evenly lit. There's not a lot of contrast going on between one part of the object of the scene and another, or in the case that there's sunlight falling directly on it, there are absolutely stark contrasts. Some of these photos may be usable for particular things, or if you just happen to capture the right moment. In other cases, you get a sort of a flat lighting. It's good for wedding photography, but maybe not for staging model photographs. So what can you do in this case? Well, you can wait for night. Nighttime is when your photos will be way more sensitive to the light conditions that you produce. So you'll have way more granular control over where lights are coming from, what they're lighting, what light is not doing. What you may lose a little bit control over is getting a sort of a full, even light in the scene, which you can take advantage of during the day, and then take advantage of more targeted and specific light during the night. Quick aside, this is what my apartment looks like all the time. All right, back in daytime, let's talk about those camera settings in manual mode real quickly before we start taking photographs.
And there's a couple things I want you to look for. One is switching it into manual or professional mode. It gives you a couple options that you can see here on the display. The option to change the shutter speed, which will actually give you an approximate preview of what the exposure in that is going to look like. The option to change the ISO, which is the sort of film sensitivity setting. The higher the ISO you go, the more grainy and noisy your photograph is going to look. So in most situations, you want to keep ISO low if you can. Probably the most important setting that I'm going to show is the ability to control focus manually, like you would do in a normal camera. So you can see here I'm panning the focus between close and far away. But what I want you to do is look in the closest focus setting. Test how far you can be from an object and still get it in focus. So you can see right now that the wall of the side of this model is out of focus. It doesn't come, sufficiently into focus until I back up. I'm between 3 and 4 inches away from that. That number is something you should remember because that's your minimum focus distance, and it's going to determine what you can possibly have in focus in the scene, no matter how hard you try. Now, another thing that I want to show you that sort of qualifies as an optional part of this workflow, but I think is really, really awesome and worth checking out, is syncing Lightroom on your phone with Lightroom on your computer, where you can do much more sophisticated edits and sort of have everything in a workflow management that works really well. I would show you that there are onboard editing tools in Lightroom, like you might have in Visco or just on your phone natively, that let you sort of change exposure and contrast and sort of tweak things a little bit. That's good. It's better to do it on a big screen where you can actually see things more clearly and more in detail, and you have sort of more flexibility of zooming in and out. But the thing that I really want to show you here in Lightroom Mobile is this little cloud up here in the top that says it's synced. So as long as you sign in with your Adobe account to Lightroom Mobile, and also sign in to Lightroom on your laptop or desktop, you can have them as long as they're connected to the same Wi-Fi network, syncing constantly. So all of the photos that I've been taking here are coming right into Lightroom, where I can do a lot more with them. Now, one of the main benefits to taking model photographs with your smartphone that we just talked about is how close you can get the focus to work to your camera lens. On the flip side, one of the main drawbacks of using a smartphone to take photographs is that you have way less flexibility over the called angle, wide or tight, the lens length that you're using to take photographs. I'm going to assume that you only have one sort of typical lens on your camera, which is a wide angle lens for most smartphones, usually around 27 or 28 millimeters, which qualifies as a sort of a medium wide perspective. You might have your typical ground level or occupant level, and it is a perspectival shot. So this is what you use a wide angle lens for. It captures the sort of perspective, the foreshortening, the things that you would get as an observer in a scene. The sort of far other end of type of shot that you might take is a zoom shot. Now I'm going to use the digital zoom on my camera just to demonstrate. Do not do this. Zooming in with the sort of onboard digital zoom of your smartphone will result in low quality photos. So if anything, crop your photo. The point is to show that this type of shot flattens the perspective in the scene. Everything is the farther away that you get, and the longer the lens that you use, the more it looks like an axonometric projection of it, where there's no foreshortening, no perspective. So let's look at 3 example photographs with techniques in each of them. For example number 1, let's try to take a relatively straightforward, maybe mundane shot and transform it into something more interesting. We're going to look at the view of the camera. Again, I'm using Lightroom's onboard camera because it's convenient. And if you use Lightroom's onboard camera and you have sync on, it automatically syncs to Lightroom on your computer. You might like your camera app better. It's fine, use it. It'll just give you an extra step. So I have
an object from Transitional Geometries here. These models belong to Wendy Wan, who kindly left them behind for me. And I'm going to sort of really quickly walk through the fundamental pieces of a lighting setup. Again, lighting it's a fruit punch of factors and feelings and flavors, and you're never going to get it entirely sort of rigorously down. What I'm going to just try to do is emphasize the importance of having a methodology, starting simple and then building up from there. So right now you're looking live through the camera view. I have every room light on. Some are halogen, some are LED. Who knows? Light is bouncing off the walls. There are about 50 different shadows being thrown on this. It's just a confusing amount of light. So I'm going to turn everything off. This is a starting point. So all I have left on here is one single light. This light I have it's an LED light, the battery powered one I talked about. You can use a flashlight or a desk lamp would be really good. Try to use LED lights just for the sake of not burning down your apartment. If you're going to be wrapping diffusing paper around lights, make sure it's not a hot incandescent or especially halogen bulb. A one light setup is the sort of simplest, maybe like portraiture light you could try to take. It gives you this kind of high contrast, moody photo. You get definitely a spicier picture, one that's telling a little bit more of a story, a little bit more emphasis on what's going on. But there are some pretty serious shadows washing out on the other side of this. So one strategy to mitigate these shadows is to add something to bounce light around. You can see I'm just using a big white piece of styrene or foam core or whatever you have. And immediately you can see that you've taken up the sort of darkest shadows on the side. It's a really good way to selectively edit the light. It's about directional emphasis of light, but yet light filling the scene from the other side as well. This is what you'll see in a portrait setup. If you want to go to a two light setup, there's a couple ways you can do it. So instead of bouncing light around with a whiteboard or something reflective, you can add a second light at a different value. This two light setup is usually called a key light and a fill light. They typically start at something like, coming at your subject from, can't get around this screen, coming at your subject from 45-degree angles. So a diffuse fill light, what we would call a key light, or something spotlighting the piece somewhere else. I have my shutter here now, so I can take photos as I need to. You'll notice something that's happening as I change the light levels is that the camera, my phone camera, is automatically adjusting to it. This is a good time to get in the manual settings of your camera. So I'm going to lock it on a relatively slow shutter speed at a tenth of a second and an ISO of whatever, 110, so relatively low. So now those manual settings are locked in. So when I change the light in the scene, I can actually see the result of those changes in the camera. This is why it's important to get to know your manual mode. All right, what other type of lights can we do in a two light setup? Well, the other main sort of position or type of light that we might talk about is called a rim light or a hair light. It's called a hair light because in a portrait studio, they like putting lights behind the subject so that you get a sort of a backlit edge. You get a really high contrast contour to the edge of your subject. Like I said, this is a sort of esoteric and trial and error kind of thing. So play around with even adding ambient light back into the room, using a brighter, more diffuse lights to get sort of right balance of contrast and shadows that you actually want in the scene. Next, I want to do a quick, say to push this a little further, we want to try some more kind of interior scene. So let's try to stage it a little bit. Important sort of rule of thumb is that it's better to move your models around than it is to move the camera. Only because when you're taking multiple photographs And you want the background and the sort of set to be identical as much as possible so that you can do the same edits and additions to multiple photos. So when in doubt, if you have the option, it's better to move your stuff around than it is to move your phone. All right, a little clumsy, but it's getting there. Little blown out. Maybe I go back and reset the exposure. All right, right there. I love it. Take the photo. Okay, photo taken. You'll notice that we're getting to the point where it's having trouble focusing on things that are entirely in the foreground. That's a product of being too close to the camera. So if you want to get these scalies that are right up in the camera in focus, you're going to have to manually turn the focus to be close at the cost of the background going out of focus. Now, this is an effect that you might like for sort of dramatic effect and separation of subject. But it can also be an effect you see if you go focus in the background that makes the foreground go out of focus and you sort of lose the believability of scale in the thing. So try to find the best focus region for the photograph, and then a little later I'm going to show you how to deal with that problem specifically. So one more thing while we're on this scene. But we talked about the use of color gels, plastic film of different colors that you can put over lights to sort of spice up the photograph. What the point I want to make is that it's not so much about spice so much as new ways of creating contrast within a scene. So say I have a scene which I'm trying to sort of depict and accentuate an interior and an exterior condition. I can use colored gel lights instead of my key lights and my rim lights to really create a lot of color separation between the interior and exterior, or whatever other conditions you're trying to depict here. Now, this can clearly get out of control and turn into a sort of a rave really fast, but the point is that it's another tool there that's in your arsenal that can be used mixed in with your other lights to create sort of new contrast that you're looking for. Okay, so hopefully that showed with this example how you can go from a pretty mundane flat photograph to something that's really sort of rich with minimal set of moves. Just positioning of lights, really like you should really only have to be using 2 lights, except for maybe very special effects. Position of camera, lock it into place, and then the manual manipulation of camera settings to get what you want. Example number 2, more of an entire building at scale model, a little bit more of an architectural object, and on a black backdrop. This time with that separation that we talked about between the table and the background. Right now, it's, I have all the lights on in the room. It's not a terrible photo. It's sharp. It does kind of have the effect of like when you're at a show and the lights come up after the end of it, like you're sort of seeing the stage revealed. So let's see what we can do to transform it into a little bit more of an interesting composition and photograph using the lighting principles that we looked at in the last example, maybe employed a little bit differently, and a couple extra, call them tricks or techniques that you can use in combination or independently, depending on what you're setting up. Okay. All right, so we start again with a single light source. You can see there's enough like lattice work and stuff happening in this model that it throws some pretty interesting shadows onto itself, something you should consider. There are a lot of dark spots that are happening within. This is pretty high contrast. So remember, the first line of defense is to try to provide a little bit of reflective surface for it to bounce things around on. I'm going to put the remote. This is another really good reason to get that $7 remote. Okay, already I like it better. So like last time, I'm going to lock the exposure settings in so it looks correctly exposed. Yeah, that surface bouncing the light on the other side is doing wonders, right? It's like I don't even need a second light or a fill light at this point. The only thing is I might want to get a little light to go into that sort of cavity in the building. Take a couple in the more high contrast version. But not a bad photograph. All right, so what are a couple things that we can do from here? Like you can do the things that we looked at last time of adding sort of colored light. It might be a little bit different, more difficult in this sort of more object-like model to get those interior-exterior things going on. But another thing you can do is, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, is using lights as backdrop. So since I have this small amount of separation, I can actually use the backdrop to throw light onto and get this kind of gradient effect there. This works on any color of backdrop. If you have a nice flat, non-drier wrinkled backdrop like mine, it'll be a little bit more flat and less textured. But the point is that you can use it like this. Create a little horizon line. My table also has like a funny Noguchi shape to it, so it's not a straight horizon line. But you can see, like, just use light as, not to sort of belabor the cliche, but use light as paint. Right. It's looking all right. One last little sort of technique or trick, if you will, is doing something with your surface itself that you're taking photographs on. And sometimes adding a reflective surface can go a long way, not just for depicting reflective conditions like water, but for changing the composition in ways that you might not exactly expect. So I have a piece of glass here because, of course, I have a piece of glass. Plexi will work just fine. My piece of glass is not quite big enough to really get framed correctly here. Let's see without the lights in the back what that looks like. Nah, I like it with the lights. Turn the lights on. Let's take this exposure down a little bit. It's getting pretty bright here. I'm going to skip forward just a minute, just in the interest of time. To ground your photographs in the scene. So you see I have Lightroom tethered or synced to Lightroom Mobile, and all of the pictures I've been taking so far are coming in. There might actually be a crack in my camera glass. It's perfect. Just Photoshop it out. But this is probably the best place to look at your photographs and to do edits to them. So on a photograph, this first one I took looks pretty good. Some of these look a little overexposed. I'm just going to go with the first one. So I'm going to take the exposure down a little bit and then bring up. It's a game when you have your backdrop black of chasing out the backdrop while preserving the shadows and highlights of the thing that you want to take a picture of. Clearly, it's better to have a more blacker backdrop and one that's not fuzzy and covered with rug and dog hair like mine.
It's going to happen at your house. Don't worry too much about it. But the real thing, you can go crazy exploring these settings in Lightroom, but the real thing I want to show you is a perspective correction. So in architectural photography, one of the main challenges of building scale photographs is perspective correction, because you're inevitably, to capture a whole building, you're going to be, unless you're Iwan Bond and have free access to helicopters all the time, you're probably going to be on the ground, and you're probably going to be using a wide angle lens to capture it, which is going to do perspective distortion and stuff like that. So what professional photographers sometimes do is use lenses that correct for that automatically. But what we can do really easily in Lightroom is make some of those perspective corrections ourselves. So if you look down here, if you go down to transform, there's an option to do a guided perspective correction, and it actually asks you to pick 2 vertical lines. Great, done. Which will straighten your photograph, which will correct for some of the foreshortening. More importantly, it'll give it that look like the photograph was taken with a longer lens to flatten the perspective a little bit. There's situations where you don't want this, but it's often easier to understand sort of overall form of a building, especially a rectilinear one, if perspective is corrected. And you can do it right here. What else do we have? Ooh, black and white. Like that one. What do we think? Okay, next thing. I'm going to show us one last third scene here to demonstrate something about using focus. Not so much focusing on the scene, although it's a little bit different than the others. How to actually use the focusing tools of your camera and software to get a picture that you wouldn't normally able to be able to capture in model photography otherwise. So this scene is set up similarly light-wise. Well, let's just say it is to our other scenarios where we have, turn our camera on, where we have a dark room. We have a primary light source that's diffused. This is kind of halfway between your key light and your fill light. That is to say, it is one directional light, but it's a little bit diffused. And then I'm not liking the harshness of the shadows it's getting there, so I might start by bringing in something to bounce light around in the scene a little bit, and you can just see already the palpable difference in the shadows on the far side of objects. But for the sake of this exercise, let's say that I'm going to put second weaker fill light in here. It's not the most beautiful lighting I've ever seen. There's hard shadows bouncing everywhere, but just go with me for the sake of the exercise. Now, we have everything here in a sort of a eye level view perspective of the scene. Again, I'm doing it in portrait mode just for the ease of using this smartphone for demonstration. But I have things in the foreground and the background and some degree of foreshortening going on because I'm using a smartphone wide lens. So what happens if, like Bob Ross, I come in here and try to ruin it with a happy little tree in the foreground right at the last second? A couple of those. I'm not sure if I can get him to stick straight up. Nope. Oh, I'm definitely going to cut this. Okay, super easy. Now I have objects in the scene that are too close to the camera lens to capture everything in focus. When your camera is trying to focus really close to the subject, by the nature of optics, your depth of field is going to get way shallower, and it gets larger proportionally as you go away from the lens, which is why when you take a picture of things far away, they're all in focus. One way that you can tweak this in the shot is to change the focus manually, like we talked about. So you can see here I have it focused perfectly on the back of the scene.
And you can see here I have it focused perfectly on the front of the scene. I would say just aesthetically out of the box, shot like this is more pleasing, but when you have a shallow depth of field, especially in model photography, it has that kind of effect of suspending disbelief of the size of the thing. Once you see something, very separated from its background, your eye and brain immediately say it's small, just because that's what we're used to seeing when we focus. So if we could somehow collapse all of these different focus lengths into one shot, we would get something that is entirely in focus despite being close to the camera, and bring the illusion of sort of scale and size that's not naturally there. So we do that with a technique called focus stacking, which I'm going to show you really quickly. So this requires a jump into another program or two in Photoshop, but the process is pretty streamlined, and it's worth knowing, especially if you're doing interior shots or really close-up photography of interior scenes. So this is where it's really important to learn your manual settings and go in here and make sure everything is locked. So I'm going to put it on, I'm going to lock it on the slowest shutter speed possible, which is 1/10 of a second. I'm going to sort of find an ISO level that I like the exposure for. Sure. Maybe I'm going to change the perspective a little bit. Yeah. Auto white balance is locked, so I don't need to mess with that. And then what I'm going to do is going from the foreground to the background, or vice versa, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to take multiple photographs, moving the focus a little bit each time. I might be doing it a little rushed and clumsily here and skipping over a couple sections of focus, but you can take your time. And you can see I'm actually getting almost to the back of the camera's focal range before I'm getting everything in focus, especially in the background. And now at this point, everything in the background, in the foreground is blurred. So this shot immediately screams miniature model. It's something that we wouldn't want to use right out of the box. So let's hop into Lightroom and talk about a couple things and then go right into Photoshop. So since I have it synced so conveniently to Lightroom, I can see all of the photos that have been bounced right out of the camera of the computer here. I look through the list, and I'm going to skip about 2 minutes. What I show here is just how to do an operation to many pictures in Lightroom at once. You can figure it out. You're smart. I'm going to jump over to importing these into Photoshop and show you what the photo stacking operation actually is. To start a new blank file at all. What I want you to do is, before you even have a blank page or template open, oh, there we go, scripts. Technical difficulties. What you're looking for is File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. So this is going to ask you for a number of files instead of an individual file. I'm going to go to the files I exported from Lightroom and import them. Now, this is important. You have to click Attempt to automatically align source layers. Otherwise, it's going to have a really hard time blending the focus together. But let's start with that and see what we get. Thinking. Okay. And I can see what we have is, if I start turning off these layers, you can see that they're all stacked on top of each other in near perfect alignment. There's a little bit, maybe it's just because of the blur, little bit of misalignment there. Once you have them all aligned and in a layer stack, you're going to go to Edit, Auto Blend Layers. And then you have two options. One is to create a panorama, which is really useful.
One is to stack the images. Now, you can stack images in multiple ways. You can stack the focus of images. You can stack the exposure of images, which is what star and night sky photographers do. But we're going to be stacking the focus. So make sure that we have seamless tones and colors is checked, and I would uncheck content aware fill. This, depending on the size and the number of the files in the stack, is a beefy operation for any computer. It might take a little while. It might also blow up my computer. That's always a possibility.
Leaving us room for a realistic effect.
Okay, check it out. This is a photo that's entirely in focus from front to back. And you can see that what it has done is created these really, really complex masks. And then it's feather blended them seamlessly into each other on each layer. So that's the shape of one mask, that's the shape of the next. It actually gives you a cool readout of where focus regions are. And you can see I've covered, looks like I've covered just about everything in this stack. It doesn't look like anything except maybe here at the very bottom is out of focus. This effect becomes more and more profound the closer you get to what might be an eye level or observer photograph, especially.
I'm going to cut it right there and say that what I'm about to say sort of feeds into what I was talking about earlier. So if you try to extend these techniques into a full-scale sort of photo studio, say that, especially with a DSLR, what you'll find is that it gets progressively more difficult to find a lens that focuses close to your subject. That is that you'll have to be, typically a couple feet away from something to have it in focus at all. And then when you find a lens that focuses closely, that effect of focus quickly dropping out becomes ever more dramatic. So this, I use this stacking focus thing all the time. It's just way more easy to really get into a model and make a scene out of it. Okay, I believe this video in itself, in addition to the lecture, is going to be available somewhere. So I don't know, Yunjie, if you want to give time to questions. I know we're just about over, but suffice to say that I'm always available for questions about this or anything else, where I live, which is in the shop.
Thank you so much, Josh. I actually personally have one question which I've always been kind of curious about, and you're, out of all of us, you're in this unique position of being actually very close to the students. Like, you have proximity to the students and the output, right, the creative output that happens at GSAPP. So I just wanted to, and you've been there several years, and I was curious, do you see a trend in what the students produce, not only what they make, but also how they document the work?
Absolutely. And I think that's what I was trying to allude to earlier in this sort of like maybe describing things as scenographic more than photographic. I feel like that the sort of types of models I see constructed to be photographed are a little bit different in that they're built to photograph a scene rather than built as a project and then photographed for documentation afterwards. I know that in fact, some of the coursework and sort of academic prompts have been sort of adjusting to this mindset as well. Like Core 1 has an entire photography segment that sort of is arranged thematically like this. My own courses, I've tried to sort of bring this style of documentation in, and I think it's fair. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the photograph of the staged model is in a lot of cases sort of complementing or even supplanting the render as sort of a means of representation on final boards of projects really frequently. And so I think all of those little things taken together are a sign of a sort of a trend in technique changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how that's how the trend was going anyway. You know, like this idea of image as currency, right? Like it's so important how things are documented, how things are shown as images, because that's how most of us will experience many of these projects. But I mean, you know, if that wasn't happening already, it's definitely been accelerated in the past couple of years, I think.
Well, I think it's really, really synonymous with this sort of collage as a sort of a being resublimated into 2D representation, you know, like the Illustrator collage as a means of documenting a project, the sort of staged model photograph. I think those two things are, you know, not too distant cousins.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a perfect segue to our second speakers. Party of One, we have Melissa Deckert and Nicole Licht from Party of One. Hello, dialing in live from Brooklyn, I believe.
Yep.
Party of One is a collaborative studio founded by Melissa and Nicole based on Brooklyn. Through combined experiences in fine arts and traditional design, Party of One specializes in visual campaigns with an emphasis on unique and often handcrafted prop designs, styling, and sets. Their clients include New York Times, Michael Kors, American Express, Mercedes-Benz, Penguin Random House, and so on. Party of One's work has been featured in a number of exhibitions across the US and has appeared in online and print publications like Plastic Magazine, Working, Not Working, AIGA, Ion Design, etc. They've also been speakers and critics at several schools, including RISD and Pratt and the New School here in New York. You may or may not have heard of Party of One, but you've definitely seen their work. Their very, very vibrant work in and around Avery and maybe beyond. Melissa and Nicole are the creative forces behind the GSAPP lecture posters of the past few semesters. These posters were typically printed in the past. They were printed pieces of communique, you know, physical artifacts that you would have printed, you know, fold them down, put them in rolls, and, you know, ship them to other schools, and they were hung physically. But now we know that this paradigm has actually shifted in the last couple of years, especially where the digital image has become the prevalent format. So I'm really excited and really interested personally too to learn more about your very specialized and multi-pronged process and learn more about your practice. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us. And also, Josh, I just want to say thank you for your talk, because we took something out of that. The focus stack is a little piece of just a photo magic that we haven't actually used, but I think we're going to pull that in for our next project.
Definitely. That was incredible.
And so much of what you showed, we have been through it. We've applied it to what we've done. So let me pull up a little presentation here. Is everyone able to see that and hear us?
Great.
All right. Well, as they said, I'm Melissa.
And I'm
Nicole. We are based in Greenpoint. This is our studio. We have some of our fun little props behind us. We consider ourselves a graphic design studio. We do everything together. We are super collaborative. And as you'll probably see through this talk, we are going to be bouncing back and forth quite a bit, describing our work. We create a range of work, usually all involving custom set design, custom props. We like to repurpose a lot of materials. Most things are handmade by the two of us. Yes. And then photography, sometimes animation and retouching are all part of the process that we take on. We sometimes take the photos ourselves, usually for editorial work or you know, more personal projects, but we also do work with other lovely professional photographers when we are being more hands-on. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're going to run through just a bit of our history and our projects. And then we are going to get into something that hopefully you guys have seen around campus, the different GSAPP identities since fall 2020. And we will dissect not this semester's, but the previous semester, which was a bit more video based
and experimental. So we can sort of like just share that process as it was a unique one.
Yeah. And we'll be showing everything, even the stuff that we were like, oh, that did not work. So hopefully you guys can pull something from that. So we actually met about 10 years ago and this, you know, similar photo 10 years before. This is from our time working in-house at Etsy. We were both on the brand design studio there.
Yeah, and we worked side by side. We created a lot of visual campaigns. We did a lot of branding work for events, but we really quickly realized how we both were so drawn to these handmade applications that could then be, used across many different platforms. So building the sets, really taking on the language of the people we were speaking to, which would be, such a huge, robust handmade marketplace, and really using a lot of the techniques that we would mirror back to the sellers and the buyers.
So this is an example of one of the holiday campaigns, which was photographed as these three sort of winter-themed quotes.
Sort of like a gift to the sellers, a seller-based campaign.
That were then translated into, this is just a few of the many sort of printed assets. There was a mural component that we took to different seller events that happened, and it was really just kind of helpful thank yous and sort of inspirational things that we could send to them.
And
because,
a bit of an activity. I think you could color that in.
But, the holidays were a really busy time for them. So it was just something to kind of show them things. So that was one of the first more tactile, photo-driven projects that we worked on together. And I think we got a taste for it and then started proposing these things in a lot of other campaigns. So here's an example of
I think
Valentine's
very
campaign.
quickly went into a Valentine's Day that was completely paper crafted, set, and monochromatic to fully showcase the products that we were talking about within the campaign. And this was translated into actual Subway campaign in Canada.
I believe so, yeah.
Canada.
So each one of the products was from a different seller, and we sort of pulled out the different technique that they used to make it.
Worked with other people on the team, and copywriters to come up with this cute idea of just the spirit of giving and making and things like that.
So, while we were at Etsy, we made a ton of different designs for a lot of different, mainly seller events, a lot of print materials, social content,
internal communications,
T-shirts.
We experimented in Vine. It was a while ago.
But as our team was growing and as the company was growing, things did need to become more streamlined. And so a lot of the really tactile sort of inspirational things that we were working on that were geared towards what the sellers were also making didn't really apply, as we had to translate to multiple languages and countries and cultures.
And as the platform grew, it just seemed better to have more of a neutral backdrop for all things. So
we both made our way out of Etsy, freelanced for a little while independently, but would pull each other back and forth into projects. And then eventually we formed our studio together. This was our Instagram launch image, which was collaged out of a bunch of different supplies. In 2019, February 2019, we officially started together. So some of the work that we do that we mentioned is primarily visual campaigns, and we will build out a full set and sort of space and concept for different products.
We really started working with a lot of very small brands and talking to them, not only about what their brand was and their products were, but just sort of focusing on either this was for a launch or a seasonal campaign, and really bringing a story and with that a setting for their items.
So this was for a luxury handbag company, and this purse was designed or inspired by Mae Jemison, who was one of the first females to go into space. And so we created this sort of retro future little padded chamber, and we wanted to bring in sort of a biohuman tech. Sort of
there's a tech component to the company as well. And
so we made a series of images for them. This is just one of those. Another one that we loved working on was a collaboration with Otherland for their 90s collection. So this was a series of 6 different sets for 3 different scents, and each one of them was really just pulled from different 90s textures and kind of hard candy finishes and satins.
Very much tied to the scents and the personal story of the founder and the names of the candles themselves. So, we have just little worlds that we're creating there. But
We created all of these things in our studio using, leftover materials, a lot of things that we would find, in 99-cent stores around the corner that we would recover with plastic or with rubber and paint and finish, so it felt like a new material.
Yeah.
So in a lot of our work, we are often repurposing things and finding things that
Just
we
a
would
lot of-
already have around.
Yeah, a lot of customization.
Just another example for a summer campaign for Sunwink for superfood powders. So they wanted something really summery and colorful and food driven. So we just created something kind of to reflect that world and wanted to bring in this faux water feeling with different iridescent acetates.
Yeah.
So this was a fun one to make. So some of our work also kind of focuses more on sustainability campaigns. So this was something for a glass company promoting the switch from plastic to glass.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little video. I'm not sure if you can hear the music that we created for them. So we worked with a photographer on this, but did all of the styling and
this is a small part of a much larger campaign, but fun to see that all those little pieces are actual tiny little pieces that we cut and placed. And then this is for Olay, and they were just a series of quick social assets to celebrate the sustainable new packaging that they're moving forward with.
And again, this is another one
And we-
with a photographer.
And we did save a lot of recycling to make these.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, and then this is our editorial work. We do quite a bit of editorial work, and it's kind of a fun little playground for us because they're, sometimes we'll do a series of images, but often it's one image, and we do make everything here, and we usually shoot it here, and we do all the retouching. So we take some liberties within that. So the pink image was for Washington Post, and there were like other little images broken out. It was actually a very fun series that I think they run every year where they have unconventional ideas of spring cleaning. But for this image, it was an extremely large setup in our studio with an overhead camera and then superimposed lettering digitally later.
So all of these actually kind of have a digital component.
Yeah.
Like the middle one was for an Airbnb cover showing off a space of one of the artists there that had a bunch of orange trees. So we brought in that element for the design. We did photograph real kind of paper lettering that was in the shape of this ribbon, but then digitally superimpose some of the different shines and shadows to make it feel more realistic. So all of them have kind of this post-production element that was added on. The one on the right was entirely collage. So we shot all of the different products overhead.
Silhouetted, and then we arranged the shot digitally afterwards. Oh yeah, the one on the left, that's actually very lightly digital. I mean, there's some retouching that we do in post to like bolster color and even things out, but that's an actual mailbox stuffed full of things. And the one on the right is
it was all made.
It was actual made
real life
set scorched earth feeling with like cut. Just I think
used a thick foam that was cut into the shape
cork
and superimposed the typography in Capture One so that we could sort of see where it would land, and then used a mixture of clay masks and spices,
a lot of cinnamon, turmeric,
and small trees to sort of get this to work, and then enhance the typography afterwards.
And this is a fun. This was for Wall Street Journal, and really we had a lot of fun changing the colors, but it really did all, as all of our things do, start with an actual image.
And then just a few more examples of some album art we've created and more personal projects that give us a space to kind of explore different ideas. The very first cover was like this very long space that we broke up into different divisions and brought in these different elements so it would feel almost like a chaotic, dangerous little space. So that was something we hadn't tried before. It was a good place to explore. And then in one past summer, we kind of embarked on our first more official personal project together that had a bit more structure, exploring collaboration in real life through an exquisite corpse technique. So each one of us, just because we had this available and we felt like it would be a cute vase, we decided to use these as our medium and would pass them back and forth and sort of build on the designs.
Yeah, it was a really good way to sort of, after working so much and so specifically with brands and concepts, to have a moment to explore, but also just create a new way of talking through actually the things that we're building. So we wouldn't really see what the other person was working on. And it was kind of an interesting challenge to meld them all together, as silly as it looks. And it was quite fun, but it gave us some space to have our uniqueness and our separate voices sort of meld. But then we did wind up retiring those and let those cans go.
So around kind of this time, this was like fall 2020. Of course, everyone was having their own experience through COVID, but we were approached from the New York Times to participate in this art and isolation series, which the prompt was really open to many different illustrators to sort of capture what their visual experience of isolation was like, or the pandemic was like.
And during this time, we had before been in the studio together all of the time and working side by side, sometimes at the same table, you know, and we quickly, as everyone else did transition to working from home. So for this, we really wanted to explore something digital, and we brought back this idea of the exquisite corpse, passing things back and forth, and working with things that we already had. Which included a very large library of paint blobs photographed and silhouetted, and then some other digital, like completely made in the digital realm, shapes and dimensions.
Yeah, so for this, our concept that we proposed was the lifespan of a vase of flowers. And so we started with a kind of open vase and then just translated it back and forth and ended up with these sort of moving, coming to life and then dying bouquets, which we've continued to explore.
We have, and this idea of refreshing, but as you can see with this image, like kind of a still chaos was forming, and that brought us to
So also during this time, and the first time that we started working with GSAPP was during the pandemic, and so we were briefed on everything that was needed. You know, at the time it was all primarily print, and we didn't know, you know, how long everything was going to be lasting, how much would need to be digital, how many events were going to be happening in real life. So we, you know, as we were presenting our concepts, we had a first meeting together to come up with concept or with ideas.
This is I'm just going to fess up. This is my desktop at that moment. But this is our new way of communicating, right? We were, Melissa couldn't see how crazy my desktop was at the time, but we were communicating through FaceTime. And there was such a large prompt to really take that into account. These quick and hasty transitions to working from home.
And also bring something that felt hopeful within everything that we were going through. So we presented this idea as one of our concepts, which ended up being chosen. And maybe this is what you ended up seeing in
the design translation of that, where we kept some chaos and brought some order, and also just really tried to speak to this move from public space to personal space and having these bits of everything around you and fodder flying in and out.
Yeah, so we showed it as studio pinboard, as just a collection of all of the inspiration and items that you have in your workspace, now that everything is slightly more personal.
And trying to have some cheer in the color, celebrating some adaptability.
So yeah, this was translated across many assets, but here are just a couple to sort of show you. That was the beginning of our GSAPP work. And for the following semester, in spring 2021, there was kind of a desire to reflect something from the previous work, but in a new way and kind of flip it on its head. So we presented a concept that was literally kind of picking up the pieces of this studio pinboard and showing some of the remnants behind it, and how we could do that in a more open way.
Absolutely. And again, we are in, spring of 2021, where we're hopeful, but cautiously hopeful, and hoping to lighten the mood and lighten the weight.
So we did use some of those shapes and kind of reference them within here, but with more of a kind of spray painty, almost like the art or work desk after you've picked up all of the different pieces that you've been working with and carried that across a few other assets. So for the semester that we're going to be talking about more fully, fall 2021, I think there was some acknowledgement through GSAPP that, you know, we really needed to move fully virtual, and maybe there's a way that we could spice that up a little bit through animation or through something that changed throughout the different months.
Just really push the digital aspects of what we're sharing. So there was a large prompt to really work with more animation and keep people engaged in that way.
So this was the resulting poster, which we will kind of we're showing it in its final form, but we're going to go backwards and show from the initial concept to the very end how we sort of arrived here, because it was a bit different for us as we were working with animation and we hadn't the previous 2 semesters. So we were a lot more process driven in how we came to the final design. And we also didn't present fully fleshed out designs in the very beginning, which we normally would do. We led more with different concepts and different ways that animation could be incorporated, but in a very loose kind of sketch form using references, and then kind of built that up together in different rounds. So we'll walk you through some of those initial concepts that were chosen. We presented 4 initially, but 2 were sort of the favorites that kind of ended up blending together. So this is the first chosen concept, dynamic dates, which ultimately we wanted to present multiple sculptural, colorful number systems that could be mixed and matched to create unique animations for every asset. And we showed some reference for this. We are pulling found imagery here just to kind of look at different textures and different colors that could be brought into this. But really graphic, really bold, really colorful, and hopefully giving us the chance to have something really unique that changed throughout the semester. And we sketched out possibilities for what these shapes could look like, what they could be made out of, still keeping it very loose.
And in that past, you can see there is like a hint of how that animation could work, and really focusing on these being those things that would move and change.
And we did lightly sketch out, how these different assets could incorporate the numbers, still very loose, but just kind of looking at different combinations. And then the other concept that they were drawn to that sort of blended in with this one was revolving months, which with this one, we were focusing more on having a unique textural animation that changed every single month and would kind of be a backdrop for the different content. So something really colorful and kind of abstracting the letter forms or the numbers that we would be using so that you could see what it was in one moment and then it would kind of become a texture in the next. And again, just pulling some different ideas of how we could sort of glitch the text or abstract it or pull away clarity and then bring it back in.
And in here, again, we're very loose. So we don't have that exact way this is going to look. And you can see there's like a mix of like a Cinema 4D, like very digital space or analog, and just sort of playing with those ideas loosely.
Yeah, that is something we weren't quite sure what our medium was going to be yet, whether we would be working with paper and photography, whether we would be kind of creating renders of things. We were just focusing on, all right, I think we're going to focus on like a textural animation, however that ends up being made. We did kind of pull out different ideas for what the different months could be, whether they're layered and chopped up or glitched or kind of more tactile or blurred.
In this initial, early on, we considered having like a far larger range of materials that we would work with, different for each month.
And then also explored, again, how that texture can come in loosely through the different assets. So within those 2 ideas that were kind of the favorites and chosen, we pulled elements from each. So we ended up kind of moving towards
melding those 2.
We decided to use the numerical system, but as a textural animation. So within that, we explored 3 different ideas that could potentially incorporate these textures. So this first idea was bringing it into sort of an abstracted shape, but then letting the text live in a sort of more simple way around it.
And we did initially, and you'll see throughout, start thinking that color should just be a moment and not the full. So in this too, we were considering that. How is color going to come into play? So we thought that the focus of the animation could bring color and the rest would remain neutral.
So this first direction, we showed an example for how it could change for each month, as well as through the event titles. But the feedback we received for this one was potentially those shapes could start to look like different countries or different recognizable places. So that was something that pulled us back from this direction. The second direction was much more layered, much more kind of visually interesting. We'd have these animations playing in the background and then have other
access.
Other bits coming up and down, and sort of really just layering all of the content and having a specific color for each one again. Also with this one, perhaps it was a bit too visually stimulating, and so we pulled back from it as well. And the final direction, which ended up being sort of what was chosen, was just more of a simple wash of this texture where you can start to see the content, the number, the name of the month within it. But all of the other sort of important content is living in its own little house and isn't really obstructed by those textures.
And with this, you know, the challenge is always really highlighting the information that we're looking to share, but also keeping a consistent visual language. So this was like the beginning of our developing, like you knew which month you were in. We could keep it fresh by rotating and changing the style for each month, or we'll see, it'll be revealed, but just really just starting to play with that tension between.
So as we presented this, that third direction was sort of chosen for us to move forward into. And so then we actually started exploring what these animations were actually going to be made out of, how they were going to look. We knew we wanted something very graphic based on that exploration and those initial designs, but we still didn't quite know exactly what they would be made out of. So we started by deciding to work in stop motion, because as we usually are layering a lot of elements in the print designs, we felt like, well, we can animate it and then we can pull those layers and we can use them for different printed pieces. So that feels like a good kind of balance in bringing in animation and then having room to play.
Yeah. And we weren't looking to make something super slick, actually. So we made a choice. I think you'll see how that played out, but just to have something, we had a lot of tactility in most of our work, and figuring out ways to sort of maintain that and keep things a little bit, keep that idea of flux and organic and touched and surprise within it.
So we started just by making these kind of large tiled patterns of what we knew would be used in the evergreen information, and also what we knew would be used for the different month markers. So we just created, simple files with this repeating number, printed them out, and then started looking at, how can we maybe break these up in a way that shows the tactility and can be photographed and animated in an interesting way. So we did that with, October and September and November, and evergreen as well. And so that resulted in these very tactile paper animations that were just photographed in multiple frames overhead, animated in Photoshop, just as our initial sort of black and white base.
Yeah.
And we did that for each one, bringing in animation in different ways and trying to kind of do different directions. So if 9 was a rotation, 10 would be more of a slice, and 11 might be more of a wave. And with this one, it was kind of a wild card. So we did more of a digital combination of elements to also create this vertical wave.
More of the scan glitch, but figuring out how that might work. We started exploring different colorways. We did initially think of this as more of a neutral, but there was a desire for color and feeling a little bit grim in the black and white. So that, color is a challenge. We played around a lot.
And I think by starting in black and white and then having the flexibility to add color in Photoshop afterwards, it really opened up a lot of possibilities and also just allowed us to stay kind of flexible, still not knowing what color scheme we wanted to work with overall. We did also kind of experiment with layering the different animations. So you'll see like on the bottom left, it's almost like 2 different tweens of different directions going back to back. And then, just
And
multiplied or inverted so that you're seeing these like backwards color combinations happening. And same with 11. We also are experimenting a bit with texture and gradients and pattern, which ultimately ended up being a bit too much, but we did kind of try a little bit of everything.
Yeah, we really did. And this is where we sort of like jumped away again. So we had that glitchy thing that felt sort of organic because, it's built in a way that could read in the same family, but just to see how would this look in a different, more slick, less hand-touched way.
I feel like at this stage of the process is what we always kind of end up getting to, where we put as much in and as many different ideas together just to see like, what are we liking from this? What are we taking from it? And I think in looking at all of these, we started to kind of decide within these animations to color, keeping it a little bit more simple, not working as much with gradient, and then using the text overlays as a way to kind of shift the color scheme from month to month.
Right.
So we started applying, we chose, a color scheme of 2 colors for each animation and started applying it into the event titles in different ways just to see how we wanted to layer that information.
Trying with different formats, maintaining a balance between, an elegant and chaotic triple composition. And these are still just works in progress. From there, this is usually we do start with the event titles just to really sharpen up the language that's going to be existing, and then move into an evergreen. So we explored a couple different ways, moving away from the glitchy. We did have some of that glitch in our photographs, so we wanted to see like how that still would play. Making decisions again about color. Does evergreen have its own? Is it a mix of all? And we moved on from this to really sharpening, well, actually, just really sharpening in on what we liked and didn't like. The next big special piece is the poster. So we have all of this fodder to work from. We have a visual language formed. We have a color scheme starting to take shape, and then started to decide how that could all work together for the poster.
These are just a few sketches, which again, we were exploring, all of these bits and pieces that we liked. I think we decided on keeping the color in each animation, just 2 colors. We liked the layering that was happening and some of the exploration, a bit of the texture. So we thought maybe the poster could be a place to show some more of those raw materials and just that initial paper, which is where it started from. So these were, quick sketches, which then we decided to photograph as our elements to collage and play with for the actual design. So we printed out various versions of what could be the titling, different elements we knew we would need. We chopped it up, we made strips, we kind of added interesting shadows, photographed it in a variety of different ways just to have a lot to play with. And then started silhouetting all of these elements so that we could really easily collage them within the design. So the very first round was sort of rough, but we started to see, do we want to bring in all of these different colors? How large do we want this title to be? Should it be black and white over like the different months' colors? Should we mix everything together? And that kind of ended up being translated into the second version, which is closer to the final, where we did kind of mix these different colors together and suggest the raw material.
Yeah, at this point we had clearly decided upon our monthly colors. We had preserved some of our material fodder, and we worked very directly from the pieces that we had actually done final photographs, like on the right where you see the strips that would form for the back copy is directly lifted from a photograph that we saw earlier.
And so the only kind of digital element to this is the final copy on the right. Almost everything else was physically photographed and collaged together. So as that was kind of the final direction, that helped really solidify where we were going to go with the other elements and kind of what direction we were taking. So we reapproached that initial evergreen, using our large sheet of paper as kind of this main hero title that we used throughout the different elements, really just playing quite a bit with collage and all of these photographed elements that we had to pull from. This animation was one of the first things that came out. It was used for eFlux, but
just a tighter exploration of how those colors play and work together, and how the animation can sort of break apart and layer upon itself. I mean, we're still in a pandemic, y'all.
And so finally with the event titles, these are pretty close to what you saw before. I think a few just text changes, but we did solidify, the colors for each month and how we wanted those to layer, and, how the animation was going to be applied. But, as something that is going to catch your attention and change every month, I feel that these kind of did that job.
Yeah, there's a desire to keep it fresh, keep it bright, keep it digital, but still human. And just really, this is where we landed.
There were also sort of monthly titles where we brought in elements from the poster to just show the different months images, still with that same kind of color coding from before. And then for the individual 11 by 17 posters, we tried to pare back in terms of color a bit, but still kept all of the layering and mainly the layering, a lot of the intensity from before, and just pulled in some of the raw materials again, so you can see the tape pieces and you can see more of
and an opportunity to still use that language of months that we had been using before. So they are all in that designed to pair with, September, October, November, and this is everything together. So from a lot of exploration, a lot of color, a lot of stylistic decisions, and still this core idea of still, we are living in this time and we are using materials that would be familiar. This is actual copy paper. Even if we're not printing out things, I think this is something that we can recognize, and things that are blowing and shifting and changing, but with some cheer.
And at the moment we are working on this current semester, which you may have already seen little bits and pieces of. I believe these have just come out, but we wanted to do something a little bit simpler with the text as we went really like full out for the last one, but use more elements that kind of represented raw materials. So we actually created a bunch of physical pieces, which we can show you after I stop sharing my screen, that were used and collaged for this, to create sort of new abstract little sculptural shapes within each one of the assets. So we're excited for you guys to see the rest of that as it comes out. Everything. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always that's a great image.
Yeah.
It's always such a treat to see other designers and their processes, and to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And to get to sort of understand how is it they create the things that they do. I think, you know how when like a film student starts to study film and it becomes sort of their thing, like the thing that they're studying, and then when they start watching films, like from that mindset, you can't like enjoy it anymore because you're just like dissecting every move like in a movie. I think as graphic designers we're cursed with a little bit of that, because we, when we look at graphic design in the world, we look at, how was this made, like what is this, what is the typeface this person's using, like, oh, this is the grid. But I think there's something really great about the stuff that you guys make, because it's very it's sort of elusive in a way, like it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on. And also because I'm, experiencing most of it digitally, but a lot of it was actually made in person, like by hand. I thought it was really great to see your sketches that you seem to actually you know, like make hand-drawn sketches, which is amazing. So you do this thing where you oscillate between like the digital space and a very, very physical space. I mean, actually cutting pieces of paper, moving them, and then taking pictures, and then like, you know, coloring them on the computer, affecting them, then bringing it back. So there's like this kind of process that's very, it's, you know, from when you look at the end result, it's just like, you know, it's very mysterious, right? It's very, it's hard to know exactly what happened. So I think it's so generous of you to share that with us and share your process. And it's really been fascinating for me, I'm sure, for the students. And, you know, it made me curious, when you start a project, when you go into a project, how much do you know of, you know, how much can you see what's going to happen at the end? Or is it just kind of you know, a mystery for you guys as well?
It really depends, honestly. I would say with editorial, we know exactly what we're going to do. That is a time where the timeline is very short, super condensed. We're aligning on a concept and there's a lot of sign off in the very beginning. So we work very tight, like our sketches get very tight towards the end, and we are very specific with how it's going to look. And we even give color reference and things like that. It's always tricky to sketch. I mean, we sometimes do like Photoshop or Illustrator mock-ups of things that are going to be photographed because it's easier for people to understand. But if sketches work, and they usually do in editorial, we will be very close to what we have sketched. With this sort of project, we were given a lot of generous space to explore. So once the initial concept was signed off on, we did an understanding, and it was like the beginning of our conversation. It was actually a very special and rewarding and unique experience for us, to have that time to really not know exactly what was going to land, and find ourselves in a spot where we could really just sort of sharpen as we went.
I'd say probably the tightest space that we work in is like campaigns for clients or for products, where we are presenting usually 3 rounds of sketches, and by the end we have everything completely colored to the exact colors that we're going to be using. We have most of the materials pulled. The composition is fairly set, and we're building directly to that. So for example, from what we showed, like the Sunwink project or Other Land, those were almost directly from sketch to the photography day. We were coming in and we had already taken iPhone mock-ups of everything.
I would say, speaking to the initial question of how much do you know where you're going to land, if there's room, we find it to try a new technique, to explore a new material. I think so much of our process is that is the magic in that.
And we are 2 people, so we naturally will kind of bring out different things in each other's process, or say, well, what, maybe we could try it this way, or maybe we can, I'm looking at it this other way, and that just kind of inherently brings out.
Like I'm running to the hardware store because I saw the thing. And I think that is actually a really nice thing that most people who come to us know that there's going to be a handmade element in there. So if we are saying we're going to make like a cushioned padded space, we will make that, but we might not make it exactly, by sketches and all of those things, but we're gonna find just the right material for it, and we're gonna make those decisions.
And to that point, you had mentioned earlier that sometimes you do your own photography, you actually shoot yourselves, and sometimes you presumably work with another photographer. Is that different? Those 2 different scenarios? Do the results vary?
They do. We tend to work with an outside photographer when we have products. It's just a different beast. When we can be more creative with the photography, like with editorial or personal projects, we'll do it ourselves, and we can, again, it's like there's some experimentation in there, but I think with a product shot, we don't really need that. We definitely have a really nice relationship with a few photographers that we work with quite often. So it's very comfortable, and it's a nice field trip for us to go and to be able to really focus on the art direction and styling day of.
We also have retouchers that we love working with, which I know so many of the initial images that Josh showed were completely unretouched, or he said that they try to capture as much in camera, which was
amazing.
Because we focus so much of the magic kind of does sometimes come in and retouching, and we both do quite a bit of retouching on some of our work, but we love working with outside people because it just like adds this other level that you can't always get straight from the camera.
And it's another nice like way to collaborate with people, to be perfectly honest. Like we have a nice relationship also with the retouchers that we work with. So we're able to really like, we know what we're all talking about, what we're looking for, and we keep them in mind when we're shooting too. So like we know what we want to bring out.
I mean, I think typically when you think of retouching, you think of, you know, turning something that was imperfect into something as close to perfect. That's how we normally think about retouching.
Absolutely.
Commercially, right? But you know, with your work, especially the stuff for GSAPP, which is, you know, I understand it's a little bit different than the, you know, some of the product campaign stuff that you guys do. But you know, so much of the GSAPP stuff was about retaining the kind of jagged edges, right? Like having things be imperfect on purpose, right? Like not having everything be completely, I mean, you had said that you didn't want it to be slick. I think that's actually a really important aspect.
You saw it kind of fall apart when we started moving towards the slick. Like it had a very different flavor and feeling to it in our experiments, even within that. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's actually a really interesting point, especially because, you know, we're in the context of a school and we're talking with students. And I think when you are a student, I think there is this kind of impulse to seem more polished, seem more professional, and have everything be very clean and slick. But I think there are real advantages to being unslick, especially if you know it and you're controlling it, and you know, you're doing it with intentionality. Could you speak to that to the students a little bit, this idea of being a little bit amateurish or unpolished but on purpose?
I think it's taken some time to really hone in what that means for us, because I know we've both had moments where things fall a little too slick and we feel like, well, what was the point of even doing all that handmade work when now it's just been retouched and polished and shined to this place where it kind of wasn't even worth it. Or on the other hand, had moments where we felt like, oh, maybe that just needed a touch more shine somewhere that we just couldn't identify initially.
It's a dance. I mean, we always, I want to speak to that, but I also want to be honest and confess that we always are considering the levels of where our work is. I think this last, what we just broke apart for you all, that was probably the most grit. There were literal grit in that, with like the scanning and the funky shadows and the bends and the rips. And that was the ideas. But I do think there is a benefit. Well, I just don't think the idea of slickness should be prohibitive. I don't think it should stop you from exploring, because I think once you're not going to even get to slick if you haven't explored. Like you need to, there has to be some intentionality and spirit within your work. And when we all start shining and glossing and using the same gradients and everything the same as everyone, everything kind of does look the same, and you're kind of losing your voice a bit there. So it's about that as well. Like just maintaining that your actual, if it's not just, you know, the touch of your hand, it is some part of your voice in that work as well, that you are coming from a specific perspective, and it's not all style. It can be lovely to look at. But yeah, the idea of perfection can sort of squash the individual.
No, I think that's a really good point. So because I haven't been on campus in person in a few semesters, actually, I'm actually not sure whether your posters were actually printed posters that were hung, or if they only existed as digital images. Were they printed?
I believe there is one printed poster on campus, like by an elevator, that we got a photo of, but I don't even know.
Okay.
Haven't physically been there, and they are mailed out in a folded form, which is
okay. So they were printed. My question was, does it matter whether something, whatever it is, a campaign image or, you know, packaging, or, you know, whatever it is that you do, does it matter whether it gets printed or distributed as like a digital image when you work on it? Do you care about that, or is that irrelevant?
A really good question. I don't know that we feel the same about this. So I want to hear what Melissa has to say.
I mean, I think in the initial concepts, it doesn't totally matter, because we're probably more concept driven generally. And then in the execution farther down the line, if we know that print is going to be a really important aspect of something, we do try to consider, you know, what color format it's going to be in, like what type of flavor we want it to have in its printed version. But I will say, I mean, I think we are primarily digital.
Yeah, I'm fine
designers.
with it. I'm totally fine with everything being digital.
But like when it's not, we do have to kind of adjust.
But of course. But I mean, I feel like we should just show, because we do have
Yes, please show us.
the newest semester, and we do have the actual objects. I mean, like, we have enough of the stuff, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We have the actual.
Everybody's getting the sneak peek.
So we actually have those pieces. So there is everything in those posters that are coming out, and it does have more of a gloss and maybe more of a imperfect, but
Is that foam? What is that? Is that foam
this
and
is
leather?
foam covered with paint with sand in it to give it a different texture.
So it kind of looks like asphalt, but it's hot cut.
And this is also just a painted foam that has sort of a leather or a clay feeling. And then these are obvious, but these were translated some. We just wanted some fun things that we could move and animate.
Oh, that's fun.
And let them not be so specific to actual building materials, but reference them in some way, feel like materials.
And we shot those pretty, modestly here in our studio on this table, just with, a single light source and a filter, as Josh showed.
Yeah.
And we hung them up by fishing wire and just filmed a stop motion of the animation, which was silhouetted for a lot of the animated content this semester.
Yeah, but as our things are translated across so many different needs and assets, the digital becomes the most important thing, because that's where they really live.
And they move, which is
So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for giving up some of your weekend to join us and show us a little bit about your process. It was really fun to see, and really nice to hear from both of you. Please enjoy the rest of your weekend. Josh, thank you also. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
No, of course. It was really nice to meet you. See you again, Josh. Have a great rest of the year. Happy New Year. And I hope to see Josh on campus, and I hope to see you guys around too. We're in the same city.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.